How long ago did I tell you this? How many? I'm not talking days, weeks, months even. I'm talking years. But those crazies that did it for that.
Hello and welcome to Cut Through, Crikey's spin-free analysis of Australian news, politics and power. I'm your host Crystal Andrews, and today I'm joined by Crikey's associate editor and tech reporter Cam Wilson to discuss US surveillance giant Palantir and its growing presence in Australia. Cam, welcome back to the pod.
Hi, good to be back.
You have been reporting on Palantir for quite some time, but in the past few weeks in particular, you've had two really big stories that have got a lot of people talking. One was an exclusive on precisely how much money the Australian government is investing in this data company, and the other is on a multi-million-dollar contract that the Department of Defence has just signed with them. So very juicy stories, and I wanted to get into the details of all of that with you in this episode. But first, I think maybe we should go over some of the basics and the foundations of these stories, because I know that many people are coming to this conversation for the first time, are kind of, newly aware of and concerned about Palantir as a company and as a topic. I've seen a lot of interest from people who, maybe would normally not be paying so much attention to the tech space and some of these ginormous companies that are increasingly, have their hands in everything that we do in our lives and how society is run. So I think we should start there. Can you give me, this is quite an ambitious question, the short version of what Palantir does and what its technology is being used for?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the short version is actually easy. The short version is that Palantir is an American tech company that does data analytics. Its products are platforms that companies buy access to make sense of all the information that their customers have. Something like that doesn't sound particularly controversial. It sounds very boring. It sounds like a boring SaaS company, but where they have gotten a lot of notoriety and a lot of attention is because of the work that they do, which is that Palantir works very closely with governments, with military, police forces, and does work that has been criticised as enabling things like mass surveillance, autonomous and AI-assisted warfare, areas that people are really worried about. Palantir has worked hand in hand with a lot of organisations to enable it, and also in a way making it very hard to know exactly how it works, because when you partner with a company that is just providing a service, the only people they have to answer to is their shareholders, and so trying to understand exactly what they're doing can be quite hard. So Palantir, in short, is like a company that helps organizations do things. The thing is that makes it so interesting is what it has been helping other people do, and it seems like it'll let them do anything.
On the more, I don't want to use the word innocuous, but like you say, in that sort of more corporate, straightforward sense, it could be solutions as simple as data organization and categorization for big companies. Like, this is a thing that a lot of big companies will have a need for and will use. But on the more concerning end, and certainly people who are more familiar with this company and maybe have been following this story along like you have, it's things like having access to quite a wide range of data, analysing and providing information back to governments and other authorities in various ways for them to be able to use in some not so palatable or boring or corporate applications. What are some of the things that popped up time and time again as being some of those less savoury, more scary examples of what Palantir can do?
Sure. So it was reported that Palantir had quite a lot of involvement in the American NSA's like mass surveillance programs. Obviously, there was a big one that was unveiled by or revealed by Edward Snowden in 2012, but reported by The Intercept in 2017 says that they were playing a really big role in facilitating that. They have been, we know that they work closely with the Israeli army, and they have been accused by the UN of facilitating autonomous and AI-powered warfare. So, choosing targets to fire upon where you don't have a human necessarily in the loop. You've got machines deciding who to try and kill. And most recently, the one that's getting a lot of attention now, which is why it's been such an issue, is that Palantir has been closely working with America's Immigration and Customs Enforcement under the Trump administration to help them with their mass deportation campaigns. And this is a great example about, where the kind of innocuous, as you mentioned, use of innocuous sounding tasks can actually end up being stuff that people find objectionable. And what Palantir has been reported to have done is bringing in all this data held by disparate parts of the US government, parts that had previously not necessarily been plugged into the immigration system, and then making it easy for people to access that and then for ICE to act on it. So I think in last year it was reported that Palantir had designed, I think what they called it, like the Immigration OS operating system, which was a system that was bringing in all kinds of data about US citizens and non-citizens, including, I think it's been recently reported, Medicaid data, so state health data, all of these things that are being used to, carry out these deportations that have sometimes been illegal, are clearly very unpopular. And so it's a great example, this in particular, that helps people understand that, there are things that organizations want to do, but one of the things that often stops organizations is their capacity. And in the case of Palantir, they have been the organization, they've been the company that a lot of organizations have gone to try and do the other things that other companies won't necessarily be involved in. And in doing so, they've built a incredibly valuable business that now Australia is a major shareholder in.
Yes, and I think in this it's also important to point out who is behind the company, because that is a big part of these concerns around Palantir. It was founded in 2003 by Peter Thiel, Stephen Cohen, Joe Lonsdale, Nathan Gettings, and Alex Karp, who is the current CEO. And I think Peter Thiel in particular has become a symbol of what is increasingly referred to as this group of people called the tech right. People who believe that, the way to fix society's problems is to give control, increasing amounts of control to tech companies and, the corresponding tech elite who run those companies, and allow them to basically implement whatever they think is best to run, societies and whole nations, while rejecting ideas that they, personally don't think are so important, things like equality and creativity. Probably best summed up in a clip of an interview with Thiel where he's asked whether he thinks the human race should continue, and he takes a very long time to answer.
You would prefer the human race to endure, right? You're hesitating.
Yeah, well,
Yes?
I don't know. I would
This is a long hesitation. This is a long hesitation.
There's so many questions implicit in this.
Should the human race survive?
Yes.
Okay.
But
So Cam, for the purposes of this conversation, and we're going to get more into this Australian sort of presence and application, is there anything else that you think people need to know about Peter Thiel and the other guys running this company right now? Anything you want to flag before we
He's a pretty interesting cat. He, I think, first made his money through his involvement in PayPal. That's a company now, and I think it's actually not as well known, but it was really like the first company on the internet that made e-commerce available. Like things that we take for granted now, it made it sending money, spending money a lot easier. And so he was part of the people involved in that, made quite a lot of money out of it. The people involved in it are they've been nicknamed the PayPal Mafia because they've spread all over Silicon Valley, including Elon Musk was one of them, and there's a few other names that you would probably recognize. He was also an early investor in Facebook, has been highly involved in them. And he wrote a book, I think now like 10 or 15 years ago, called 0 to 1, which in which this is him at his most buttoned down. You think if you write a book, you're putting your statement out there, you're probably trying to put your best foot forward, trying to make things as palatable as possible. And he talks about all these ideas about how, for example, monopolies are actually a good thing for business because, we waste so much money competing with each other, trying to bring prices down or whatever. It's actually much better for everyone if we're a monopoly. He's spoken in the past about having pretty, I would call them like anti-democratic views. I think he's even mentioned about regrets about women getting the right to vote. So he's a guy who is one of those technocrats who has clearly taken that to the nth degree where he believes in a world where democracy is not best and that it should be ruled by powerful rich people like him. And Alex Karp, who's the current CEO, is also like pretty vocal and not very guarded with some of his views about he's extremely pro-US and like pro the West, and he talks about how his point of the company is to uphold the West as a cultural force as well. So we talk about this very, when you drill it down, very boring sounding company. And I should say, like, I remember reading a blog post about someone who used to be involved in it, who was just like, this is all the management consultant stuff that we do. It's not that different, I guess, in many ways to like KPMG or whatever, and how they approach the problems. And they combine that with the technology to be so valuable. So you've got that, which kind of sounds, again, not super out of the ordinary, but when you hear the express public comments of the people who are behind it, when you see the kind of work that they're doing, you can clearly understand why this isn't just an ordinary company. This is a company that has attracted a lot of attention and questions about, for example, why other governments, including the Australian government, should rely on them, invest on them, when they clearly have objectives that many of these other countries and their populations might find objectionable.
It really drives home that point of the very sort of mundane, basic tasks and systems and processes that can be used to do quite evil things. You've brought us very nicely to talk about the first story that I want to discuss of yours. We published this a couple of weeks ago, an exclusive that got a lot of people's attention. As of the 30th of June 2025, so the end of that financial year, the Australian Future Fund, which is this country's sovereign wealth fund, was holding just under 500,000 shares in this company. And now, given that the stated purpose of the Future Fund is to invest for the benefit of future generations of Australians, your piece and the revelations in it were quite shocking to many. Can you tell me where this investment sort of began and how it developed over time? Because it didn't just start at like $100 million straight out of the gate, did it? Like, we started with quite a smaller amount, I would imagine.
Yeah, as you mentioned, it started off with not a whole lot of money in altogether. And, the Future Fund has hundreds of billions of dollars invested in all kinds of places. So, at that point, it was essentially nothing. And then over the period of 2.5 years, it increased the stake exponentially. Like, it went from 1 million in mid-2023 to $25 million at the end of 2024 to, by the end of 2025, to be $100 million. So a pretty significant stake in this company. And, some of this was Palantir stock increasing in value because over that period, people can probably imagine a couple of things is happening, but there has been the kind of renewed conflict between Israel and Gaza since October 7, 2023, and then the Trump administration getting into office, being elected at the end of November 2024, but coming into office in the start of 2025. The Australian government has increased its stake, both through the natural increase of the value of these shares, but also clearly through investing more money in it, by putting more money into it over that period. And I think that there's two things happening there. There's the fact that Palantir has been so closely tied to the Trump administration. It's co-founded by Thiel, who was one of the first people to endorse Trump in 2016 and has had a close link to that world. They've done a lot of work. They've got a lot of contracts. They've clearly not had any issues with doing all the things that the US administration is doing. And as a result, they've become a more valuable company. And so while that's all been happening, very, very public, Australia's Future Fund has actually been putting more money into this, has been spending more money in buying it, and as a result now has a 9-figure stake in the company.
Yeah, you and I worked on a timeline, sort of like a graphic to help people follow that growth along and point out some of the, really violent events that Palantir was involved in at the time that this Australian stake in the company was growing. I'll also get that graphic up on the screen so people can follow. While the Future Fund was holding a stake in Palantir, the New York Times had an investigation which alleged the Trump administration greatly expanded Palantir's access to American citizens' data. That was followed by the UN report coming out alleging that Palantir was providing AI systems to the Israeli military for use on the citizens of Gaza. Then there was also earlier this year an expose by 404 Media, an independent publication in the US, about a Palantir tool that was being used to map deportation targets, and that those data systems were used in the ICE raids in Minnesota, including the raid where an ICE agent shot and killed nurse Alex Pretty. So this has all been happening while Australia has not only been holding but growing and, just sort of doubling down on the investment while these things have been very publicly taking place. Like, none of this is a secret. Do the administrators of the Future Fund, or at least the representatives who go to things like send estimates and answer questions about this, how do I phrase this? Do they seem to care that there are these, quite compelling human rights questions, if I'm being generous, over how Palantir is being used, or are they kind of hands-off about all of this that's going on?
When I did the original reporting, I went to Future Fund and I didn't hear anything back from them. And then when there was Senate estimates a few weeks later, Greens Senator Barbara Pocock asked the Future Fund about it, said if they're aware of these human rights records, said if this investment was allowed under the Future Fund's guidelines, because it does have a set of rules for responsible investing, things that they said that they won't invest in. But when the senator asked about it, Future Fund initially said, well, look, the rules that we have, about what we can and can't invest in, that we shouldn't invest in unethical things. We draw the line at things essentially that are illegal or go against treaties, like international agreements that Australia has signed, and Palantir doesn't go against any of those to their knowledge. They then also said that, just to be clear, sorry, I'm laughing because it's a really funny thing to say when you're the head of the Future Fund, you're the person in charge of this, being like, all that money that we're responsible for managing, we didn't actually directly manage all of it. They said that they invest in Palantir via two index funds or two external funds. So, I'm not a business expert, but as many people would know, there are plenty of, if you have money, you can obviously buy shares directly, or you can invest in funds that invest in shares for you. So you buy into them, and so you're indirectly buying into those stocks. Future Fund said two of the funds that we invest in Palantir. They also said it's a very widely held stock, and so as a result, we're not actually responsible for doing this, which to me, I don't even think I need to editorialize, is a very weak defense of this, saying that it's literally not illegal, and also we didn't directly do it. And the Future Fund representatives did kind of mention that there had been some due diligence, but essentially not really much. And they said, we do a lot more due diligence on Australian shares and companies that we invest in, but for the international ones we don't do as much because we have much less limited ability. So essentially saying we don't really know. It doesn't sound like they've done a lot of investigation into Palantir, and they certainly didn't commit to doing anything about it. So there were some little breadcrumbs that came out of there that I think we can use to find out a little bit more about this, to what extent they've considered it. I very much doubt that the first time they heard about their investment in Palantir and some of the stuff that they had been doing that was controversial was when I sent in a media request to them. But I guess we will see if there is any follow-on from this. And I think as well, just putting it in context, there are some people who think that investing in Palantir is beyond the pale. Clearly some don't. But it is being used very closely by the American government. And if you look at many of our other interactions with the US government and what they're doing for things like AUKUS, etc., it's clear that it is government policy not to have any distance between us and what the US government is doing. And so I guess in that way, it would actually be, I think, quite a significant thing and quite a departure if the Australian government was actually, we can't invest in Palantir, a major service provider for the US government.
Yeah, you're right. That there is sort of like two tricky ideas to hold here. Like you said, so much of what we know that Palantir is doing, and I should say that's only what we know of. I think it would be foolish to assume that there aren't other things happening that would also be just as unpalatable and just as scary that we perhaps just have not found out about yet. So that's certainly the case, and that would be cause for concern for a lot of people and potentially could be a red flag or a trigger about whether this company was appropriate to invest in for something like the Future Fund. However, on the other hand, America is an ally, and there certainly has been an approach from not just this federal government, but every federal government that I can think of where, well, America is an ally, and if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for us. And that almost in and of itself is the vetting process, entirely separately to whether or not that is actually a reasoning that, you know, passes any sort of bar. Having said that, it is also the case that the Australian government itself has contracts with Palantir, and so it's possible that that's another reason why, if and when this was looked at as being a question about whether the Future Fund should invest, they said, well, actually, we're using it, so there shouldn't be any cause for concern in investing in it. Palantir has secured contracts with lots of other Australian companies as well. I think a lot of listeners would be familiar with the fact that Coles has a 3-year deal with Palantir that's kind of active at the moment. And also this week you reported that Palantir has secured a new 1-year $7.6 million contract with the Department of Defence's Cyber Warfare Division. That might not sound like a particularly large amount, particularly when it comes to defence contracts, but it did not go through the normal sort of tendering process for government contracts. So Cam, can you tell me what you were able to find out about what's going on here?
Yeah, sure. So this latest contract that was inked earlier this month and published online was put to what's called a limited tender, which is, you know, like when it comes to government best practice, is this idea that, you know, for many things, if you want a supplier to give you something, you've got to say, who wants to give me it? I'll put an open tender out, people can put in their applications, you consider it. There are variations of that. Sometimes there's what's known as like, you know, panels like preferred providers being like, we don't want to have to go into open tender every single time, so, you know, here are the preferred people and, you know, choose between them. And then sometimes there's just limited tender, which is when the government essentially has to make a case that only one provider would do. Let's not waste time. Let's not fuck around. Let's just go. Sorry, can I swear?
Yes, you can swear.
Good. Well, I did. They're like, we want to go straight to one provider for a variety of reasons. And the reason that was justified in this contract was that essentially this was a continuation of a previous service. I believe, I'm not certain, but based on previous contracts, there was another similar contract that was signed by the Cyber Warfare Division that finished at the end of last year. So it makes sense to sign a new one now to kind of continue on. What exactly it's for is a little bit unclear. It was listed as ICT software, information software. I think the previous one was just listed as software, so you're not getting a whole lot of explanation about what exactly they're crunching the numbers for, but you can probably imagine given the very evocative name of the Cyber Warfare Unit. So yeah, I mean, that was I think that brings it to more than $25 million in contracts from the Department of Defense over the last couple of years. There've also been like a number of other government departments and agencies that have contracts or have signed contracts with Palantir, which include the ASD, which is, you know, one of the spy agencies, and I think the other one is the Australian Crime Intelligence Commission. And there's also a number of other Australian companies, big businesses that you would have heard of. Coles, Rio Tinto have signed contracts with Palantir. So there, you know, Palantir has, I guess, a growing role in some of Australia's most important and biggest government departments and businesses in Australia. And one of the critiques that's probably a little bit less sexy than some of the other ideas about, you know, facilitating mass surveillance, etc., is that Palantir is also a company that has been very good at kind of getting its claws into organisations and government departments and having what's known as vendor lock-in to be able to get more and more money from them. And so fundamentally, you know, even when you put away some of the ethical stuff, which is important, you are increasingly privatizing capacities that the government should be doing. And the side effect of this, more than just money, is just the fact that it's, as I mentioned before, much harder to know what a company is doing, what's happening behind the scenes. That limits that oversight too. When you have Palantir doing these kinds of purposes, you don't know what technology they're using, you don't know how they're using it, you just know that they are doing certain things. And it's very hard to then have any oversight over it. And so that's a downside, I think, for many people. But perhaps for government, that's an upside as well, because it also gives you someone else to blame and to kind of hide how the sausage is made.
Yeah, it's interesting. We actually did have a cut-through listener send in a question asking about whether there's a process of like potential extrapolation from Palantir for Australia. That certainly is one of the big sort of like red flags that people talk about, is companies like Palantir build these walled gardens that once you're in, you're kind of locked in. And from a government perspective, that means so the money that goes into these contracts maybe is kind of on the smaller side in the beginning, but then because you are locked in, it justifies potentially the growing expense of these contracts. I know that our colleague Bernard Keane has written a lot about waste in the Department of Defence in general. So that would certainly be one of the concerns. I don't suppose you have any insight on whether the Australian government is looking to extrapolate from Palantir, but I mean, I guess signing new contracts means probably not.
The thing that I think is interesting to consider with this is this broader theme of sovereignty. We hear it a lot with manufacturing, production, etc. But it has been a really, really big issue in technology for the last year or so, particularly under the Trump administration, because for the last 15, 20 years at least, the US has been the center of the world when it comes to technology and when it comes to the internet, and as a result, they're we're all kind of playing on their turf, and for the most part, that has been apolitical, or at least nothing is truly apolitical, but has tended to that has often managed to stay out of the political fray. But what we've seen under the Trump administration, what we've seen with how big tech companies who are so big that you think that might give them strength, but it actually means that they're incredibly vulnerable to the government in many different ways, have cozied up to the Trump administration, and as a result have done certain things that make people rightly or wrongly believe that they are changing international policy, the rules for everyone around the world, based on what they think the Trump administration wants. The great example is when in January last year, just months after Trump won the White House, but before he was even in office, when Mark Zuckerberg did that really cucked video where he was like, we've been wrong in the past, we've made all these mistakes about free speech, and so we're getting rid of fact-checking. All of those discussions, and as well the increasing authoritarian rule by the US administration, where they've been willing to use powers to crack down on their political enemies, has all made people really uneasy. We used to see a lot of this discussion around China. People would remember in Australia when we were talking about TikTok back in 2022, around that time, and I was saying there's national security laws that means that all the data held by TikTok could be used by the CCP. That same critique that people were really worried about is really applicable to the US, and the US has had so much of the internet's infrastructure in their backyard that it has a lot of people really worried. An example that is very real, this isn't a hypothetical risk, Francesca Albanese, who is at the UN Special Rapporteur to Gaza, I believe. She was actually behind that report that I mentioned before that linked Palantir to autonomous use of weapons. She's now being subjected to sanctions by the US, and as a result, US companies can't do business with her. She can't have a Microsoft account, she can't have a Gmail account, all of these things, because it is now a crime to do business with her. That is the thing that has gotten people worried. And so what's that got to do with Palantir and us? Well, we just need to consider that we're using this foreign company and entrenching it in these very powerful government departments, handling highly sensitive data, the way that data could be used, the implication of them fundamentally being under US law. They're, speaking about Alex Karp, the co-founder before, his stated and very open desire to use the company to further the interests of the US. I mean, this can have implications from the kind of, the more like scary ones, even things being like, maybe they would refuse to work with certain partners. Maybe they'd be like, well, Australia, like if you want to work with us, you can't work with this Chinese company. There are all the ways that this power can be flexed, and so the increasing reliance by Australian government on Palantir represents this strategic weakness that, for a long time we've just assumed the US and our participation with them and their companies is about as safe as it can get. Now people are really looking at that, they're reconsidering that, and I think that they have good reason to as well.
Even earlier on when we were talking about the tech ride and Peter Thiel and Alex Karp talking about their ideas and Karp's ideas in particular about the supremacy of the West, I think even for Western nations like Australia should be very alive to the fact that what that actually means is the supremacy of the US specifically. Their vision of that is, even if you are part of that club where they say, hey, we think you have similar values and lifestyles, that is still for them maintaining the US and really themselves at the top of that chain. In government, I know that the Greens have been very critical of Palantir's growing footprint and increasing government contracts. David Pocock as well, the independent senator, has been making it known that he's concerned about this and that Australians should be concerned and should be following closely. Is there anyone else in government, or particularly in the tech sphere in Australia, who's ringing alarm bells around Palantir that you know of, or is it all a little bit more quiet on the tech front?
Marinus.
You do hear things anecdotally. You're not hearing anything from tech leaders. I mean, I think that everyone knows that given the Trump administration's use of power, how many of the companies now are, even if it's just temporarily working alongside them, it's just something that is not really worth sticking your head up. And I think that's, that has been a attitude that's come out in a lot of areas of the world where it's like, with something like Palantir, why would you stick your neck out to take a stand on something like this when not only are you potentially not using a supplier who, by all accounts is doing, like, clearly they must be doing something good if people want to use their services, but also, risk facing the wrath of the administration. So I haven't really seen that much. We've seen in the US that tech employees generally have now started speaking up a little bit more. It isn't in stark contrast to the first Trump administration, where people might have forgotten that, like, the tech industry was actually pretty outspoken in many cases about opposing what Trump was doing. They've been much more compliant and actively, participating and enabling in this time. But now you are seeing some of the workers step up a little bit more. Palantir has had to kind of take some steps to quell inside turmoil from staff. But, I also think it's kind of, if you're working at Palantir in 2026, you kind of know what you signed up for. So the fact that even staff are even raising eyebrows and rattling the fence at that, I think does kind of show how things have really escalated. So I wouldn't say that there's like a super organized pushback in Australia, in anywhere else. Lord knows how successful it will be, given the fact that we have all these ties to it, and every tie that you make, that makes it harder and harder to kind of break those ties. There's more kind of like stasis, there's more friction. But this company and its involvement in the Trump administration and what it's doing is not going away. I think that over the next few years, we're only going to get more insight into exactly what's happened. Who knows how it will continue to change over the next few years, what the administration does. Maybe it will get more extreme. There'll be some Democrat oversight potentially if they win the midterms, so maybe we'll have more insight into this. There's a lot of ways that there could be more pressure placed on Palantir and based on all of these companies that are, and government agencies that are working with them. So I don't think it's the end of the story, but right now I wouldn't say there's like an armed rebellion that's at the gate threatening to invade.
Yes, indeed. Well, hopefully for those who are kind of new to the story, we've helped you a little along the way in understanding what is, a very, very tangled web between tech and politics, the US, Australia, and many, many other countries around the world. Thanks so much for helping me walk through this, Cam. I appreciate it.
No worries. I'm so glad that I could share the story of the world's most controversial SaaS company, which I know everyone loves talking about B2B businesses.
It's a LinkedIn post for sure. If you enjoyed this episode of Cut Through, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating or review for the podcast. Crikey is 100% independent, which means your support.
Crikey, I think you need to look a little bit deeper into Marinus and Lockheed Martin.